I never thought I'd find myself in such a complicated situation. When I married Greg, I knew he had a son, Jason, from his previous marriage. I wasn't much older than Jason, and when I first met him, I could tell he wasn't sure what to make of me, a stepmother who was closer to his age than his father's. Awkward, to say the least. But over time, that awkwardness faded, and something else replaced it. Something I wasn't prepared for. Jason was a good kid, smart, funny, and sensitive in a way that made him different from most guys his age. He had this quiet intensity about him that I found myself drawn to. I didn't plan for it to happen. At first, I just wanted to get along with him, to make life easier for all of us. After all, I had stepped into a family that wasn't mine. But as the days passed, I started to enjoy our time together more than I should have. It began innocently enough. Greg was always traveling for work, leaving Jason and me alone in the house. We'd chat in the kitchen while making dinner, sometimes stay up late watching movies together, or head out for early morning runs. It felt natural, even comforting. But the more time we spent together, the more I noticed Jason's eyes lingering on me. He was looking at me differently, like a man, not a stepson, and I didn't stop him. In fact, I started looking back. There was a thrill to it, something that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't expected. I knew it was wrong. I knew I shouldn't be entertaining these feelings, but they crept in like a slow-burning fire, warming the space between us. I convinced myself it was harmless, just a little innocent fun, right? He probably didn't even notice. But I was wrong. One night, with Greg out of town, Jason and I planned to watch a movie. It wasn't the first time we'd done this, but that evening felt different. There was something in the air, a kind of tension I couldn't shake. Jason sat close to me on the couch, closer than usual. His knee brushed against mine, sending a strange shiver through me. I felt my pulse quicken, and suddenly, I didn't know where to put my hands or how to breathe. I glanced over at Jason, and for a brief moment, our eyes locked. His gaze wasn't the usual casual look I'd gotten used to. No, this was different. It was intense, focused, and it lingered. I could see the questions in his eyes, the ones he didn't dare ask out loud. I should have looked away. I should have said something to break the moment. But I didn't. I couldn't. Just as the tension reached a breaking point, I panicked. I shot up from the couch, mumbling something about needing fresh air. I left Jason sitting there, probably as confused as I was, wondering what had just happened between us. What was I doing? I was his stepmother. This could never happen. Yet, despite my racing heart and flushed cheeks, I knew I wasn't just imagining things. Something had shifted between us, and now there was no going back. After that night, things between Jason and me changed. Though we never spoke about it, we didn't need to. The tension was there, lurking beneath the surface of every interaction. I told myself to be careful, to keep my distance. But somehow, we always found ourselves in these intimate moments, moments that felt like they were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Greg was still away for work most of the time, which only made things worse. Jason and I were left alone in the house far too often. I'd catch him watching me, his eyes following me as I moved around the kitchen or sat beside him on the couch. I tried to act like it didn't affect me, like I wasn't aware of how the air between us seemed to crackle every time we were in the same room. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him either. It wasn't just physical, though that was part of it. There was something about Jason's presence that made me feel seen, really seen, in a way I hadn't felt with Greg. Greg was a good man, but he was distant, always more focused on his work than on me. With Jason, it was different. He paid attention to the little things. He noticed when I changed my hair or when I wore a different perfume. He'd compliment me, casually at first, but then his words started carrying more weight, more meaning. "You look nice today," he'd say, his eyes lingering on mine just a little too long. "Thanks," I'd reply, trying to sound casual, but inside, my heart would race. One afternoon, I was in the living room, reading a book, when Jason walked in. He sat down beside me, closer than usual. I could feel the heat from his body, the space between us narrowing with each passing second. My pulse quickened, but I pretended to stay calm, flipping a page in my book, though I hadn't read a word. "You're always reading," Jason said, his voice low and soft. What's so interesting about those books? I glanced up at him, smiling slightly. You could learn a lot from reading, you know. He leaned in a little closer, his gaze never leaving mine. Maybe you could teach me, he said, and the way he said it made my stomach flip. I knew I should have put some distance between us, made an excuse to get up, but instead, I stayed right there, feeling the weight of his words hanging in the air. There was a part of me that wanted to see how far we could take this, how close we could get before it all spiraled out of control. We sat like that for what felt like forever. The silence between us spoke louder than any words could. I could feel my breath catching in my throat and my heart thudding in my chest. Jason was staring at me, his eyes dark and serious, like he was waiting for me to make the next move. But I couldn't. I knew the line we were dancing on was getting thinner and thinner with each passing second. Suddenly, Jason reached out and placed his hand on mine, his fingers warm and steady. It was such a small gesture, but it sent shockwaves through me. I froze, staring down at our hands, my mind racing with a million thoughts. I should pull away. I should tell him this was wrong. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. He squeezed my hand gently, and I felt my resolve crumbling. This was a line we couldn't cross. We both knew it. But in that moment, neither of us seemed to care. The world outside of that room didn't exist. It was just us and the weight of what we wanted but could never say out loud. But just as quickly as it happened, I pulled my hand away, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood up abruptly, trying to steady my breathing. We can't, I whispered, not trusting myself to look at him. Jason didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I could feel the tension still hanging in the room, thick and suffocating. I turned and walked out, not daring to look back, knowing that if I did, I might not be able to stop myself from crossing that line for good. The days that followed were unbearable. The tension between Jason and me was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch seemed to pull us closer to that invisible line, one we both knew we couldn't cross but were constantly tempted to. I tried to distance myself. I'd stay in my room, avoid lingering in the living room or kitchen when I knew Jason would be around. But no matter how hard I tried to escape, he was always there, a constant reminder of the pull I felt toward him. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. One evening, Greg called, saying he had to extend his trip for another week. It should have been a relief, knowing I had more time to get a grip on my feelings. But instead, my heart sank. Another week alone with Jason. Another week of navigating the growing tension that neither of us seemed able to avoid. That night, I stayed in my room, pretending to read, but failing to focus on a single word. My mind kept drifting to Jason. Was he thinking about me too? Did he feel the same pull I did, or was I just imagining it all? The uncertainty gnawed at me, making it impossible to sleep. Then there was a soft knock on my door. I froze, my heart jumping into my throat. I knew who it was before I even heard his voice. Linda. Jason's voice was quiet, hesitant. Can I come in? I hesitated, my mind racing. I should say no. I should tell him it was late and that we could talk tomorrow. But instead, I found myself saying, "Come in." The door creaked open, and Jason stepped inside, looking almost as nervous as I felt. He closed the door behind him, standing there awkwardly for a moment as if unsure of what to do next. I sat up, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that nothing would happen. Nothing could happen. But when Jason finally spoke, his voice was low. Here are more examples with added punctuation. It wasn't much older than Jason, and when I first met him, I could tell he wasn't sure what to make of me, a stepmother who was closer to his age than his father's. Awkward, to say the least, but over time, that awkwardness faded, and something else replaced it. Jason was a good kid, smart, funny, and sensitive in a way that made him different from most guys his age. He had this quiet intensity about him that I found myself drawn to. One night, with Greg out of town, Jason and I planned to watch a movie. It wasn't the first time we'd done this, but that evening felt different. He probably didn't even notice. But I was wrong. Maybe you could teach me, he said, and the way he said it made my stomach flip. Are you sure? He asked, stepping even closer, his eyes locked on mine.